Search for Truth 2, Lesson 4, Chart 1. Bondage and oppression prompted God's covenant people to long for their promised land. God heard their groans and sent a deliverer. We now leave Genesis, the book of beginnings. Exodus describes the exit or departure of Israel from Egypt. Leviticus, relating to the Levites, teaches the holiness of God and how to properly approach Him. Numbers is so named because the Israelite fighting force was twice numbered. Deuteronomy, the second law, records Moses' farewell address. This book prepares Israel to enter the promised land and encourages them to renew their covenant with God. But why were they in Egypt? Had Israel and his sons remained in grandfather Abraham's promised land, they would have died during the severe famine. In Egypt, they had flourished into a large nation. Fulfilling the promise made to Abraham, they had begun to multiply as the stars of heaven and sand on the seashore. Exodus 1:7 says, "And the children of Israel were fruitful and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceedingly mighty, and the land was filled with them." Without persecution, Israel might never have departed from their adopted land. As the Hebrew slaves became more miserable, their sighs and cries blended into a groan, and God heard their groaning. Do you suppose that 20th century pressures and problems might also be toughening for us to troublesome times just ahead? Paul reminds us in Romans 8:28, "All things work together for the good to them that love God, according to His purpose." Fearing that the Israelites would join with an enemy king in time of war, the Pharaoh oppressed Israelites, hoping to stunt their rapid growth. But during strenuous labor, they multiplied. Then the Hebrew midwives were ordered to kill every male child at birth, but they feared God and would not obey the command. Finally, Pharaoh commanded the Egyptians to report the birth of male Hebrew babies, whereupon the infants would be drowned in the Nile River. Birth of Moses. About this time, Amram and Jochebed, a godly couple of Levi's tribe, were blessed with a fine baby boy. They saw that he was a proper child, Hebrews 11:23, and determined to keep him. After concealing their baby at home for 3 months, Jochebed constructed a small chest-like ark and sealed it with pitch. The tiny ark was strategically placed where the princess usually bathed. Miriam, the child's sister, was instructed to watch. When the baby began to cry, motherly instincts were instantly aroused in the princess's heart. She determined to rescue the baby for herself. Quickly, Miriam offered to find a nursemaid, and his own mother received wages for doing what most pleased her. The princess named the baby Moses, meaning, "I drew him out of the water." Moses' most beneficial education was from his God-fearing parents. He learned precious truths and stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. In the East, children were usually nursed the first 3 years. Moses' mother had a short time to teach her son, but it was his only parental instruction about God's ways. The child was adopted by the princess and given a royal education. Pharaoh provided free lodging and education to the very man that would accomplish what Pharaoh was trying to prevent. Once, while visiting a royal construction project, the young Hebrew observed the inhumane treatment of his people. Remembering his mother's teaching, Moses made the wisest choice of his life. Hebrews 11:24-26 says, "By faith Moses, when he was come to years, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the pleasures of sin for a season, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt." Having made his decision at the age of 40 years old, Moses launched into his role of deliverer, but without divine mission or command. He reacted and killed an Egyptian taskmaster and hid the body in a shallow grave. The following day he tried to settle a Hebrew dispute, but one asked, "Do you intend to kill me as you did the Egyptian?" With the secret exposed, Moses was compelled to escape for his life. Moses fled to Midian. Another 40 years were spent in the Sinai, pronounced Sinai, desert as a shepherd. God calls Moses. Once while tending his sheep, a spectacular sight arrested Moses' attention. A wild acacia bush was enveloped in flames, but was not consumed. As Moses investigated, the angel of the Lord spoke from the burning bush. "Moses, do not come near. Put off your shoes, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." God spoke, "I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have seen the affliction of my people, and I am come down to deliver them from the hand of the Egyptians and bring them to a land flowing with milk and honey. I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people out of Israel." Then Moses questioned what name of authority should be given. Who was the God of his fathers? Until then he had been known as Elohim, Shaddai, or Yahweh. His new name would be I am that I am, meaning he who alone exists. The great I am is the one God. For the first time, a man was empowered to draw attention to God's greatness through the working of miracles. God commanded Moses to throw his ordinary shepherd's staff to the ground. When it became a serpent, at God's command to grasp the serpent by the tail, it became a rod in Moses' hand. A second sign involved Moses' hand. First it became leprous, then cleansed. The third sign was power to turn the Nile's water to blood. To Moses' excuse of having a speech defect, the Lord appointed Aaron, Moses' brother, as a spokesman. With a divine commission, Moses returned to Egypt with his wife and 2 sons. Before reaching his destination, however, Moses learned another important lesson. The covenant sign of circumcision had been neglected in one of his sons. Moses was suddenly stricken ill as the Lord sought to kill him, Exodus 4:24. When he and his wife perceived the purpose for the sickness, Zipporah herself performed the rite. Immediately Moses recovered. To be a lawgiver and leader, Moses must observe God's first command to Abraham. Without circumcision, an Israelite was alienated from the covenant. Moses and Aaron before Pharaoh. Back at Egypt, the 2 brothers met with the elders of Israel to deliver a divine message. Haughtily, Pharaoh asked in Exodus 5:2, "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? I know not the Lord, neither will I let Israel go." Unrelenting, Moses and Aaron presented persuasive reasons. Their labor was doubled. Formerly, straw had been provided. Now they must find stubble to make bricks. Incidentally, archaeologists have uncovered Egyptian buildings with bricks made of stubble rather than straw, as recorded in Exodus 5:12. When Pharaoh demanded to see a miracle, Aaron threw Moses' rod to the ground and it became a serpent. The sorcerers and magicians performed a similar feat, but Aaron's rod swallowed up theirs. Plagues of Egypt. Unlike other Eastern rulers, the Egyptian Pharaoh did not rule for the gods, but was literally one of the gods. The first plague, the Nile River turned to blood. Pharaoh's magician counterfeited this miracle, but they were powerless to change the blood-red Nile to its original condition. The consequences for the next refusal was an epidemic of frogs. Pharaoh's magicians were powerless to remove the plague. The third plague swarmed Egypt. Dust turned into gnats. Authorities believed that lice should have been translated as gnats or mosquitoes. Next came a plague of flies. From this plague, the Israelites had their property protected. A highly contagious cattle disease then infected the cattle. horses, donkeys, oxen, and sheep. All livestock in the field or open air died. Still, Pharaoh refused to allow Israel's freedom. A sixth plague, open running boils, appeared on men and beast. The seventh plague was an unprecedented, violent hailstorm. Flax and barley crops were totally destroyed. So impressed was the Pharaoh by this hail that he confessed, "I have sinned this time. The Lord is righteous, and I and my people are wicked." Exodus 9:27. Locust plagues were so fearsome in ancient Egypt that peasants prayed to a locust god. A locust can daily eat its own weight in volume. 1 square mile might contain 100 to 200 million insects, and a swarm might occupy an area of 400 square miles. Egypt's crops, fruits, and trees were stripped down to the trunks and limbs. In the ninth judgment, a thick darkness that could be felt covered the land. Exodus 10 and 21. The final plague, death to the firstborn of man and beast alike. The Passover. As the last and most dreadful plague was readied, God introduced a plan whereby he would redeem man from sin, the blood of atonement, meaning to cover man's sins. Notice in the Passover story the many comparisons with the coming Lamb of God. God instructed that a select lamb would be offered as a substitute for the firstborn child. Each lamb must be killed in the evening and roasted with fire. All the flesh must be eaten with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. As they ate, everyone must stand around the table, clad with shoes and staffs, ready for travel. Before eating the meal, each family leader must sprinkle the lamb's blood on the 2 posts and lintel of the doorway. It declared the necessity of a blood covering for sin. The entire Passover story illustrates that Christ would be sent to earth as God's perfect lamb. His sinless blood would cover and cleanse us from sin. As Paul wrote in Hebrews 9:26, "Once in the end of the world hath he appeared to put away sin by the sacrifice of himself." At midnight, the Lord himself went through the land executing judgment against the firstborn and all the gods of Egypt. Exodus 12:12. Only those protected by the blood were passed over. From Pharaoh's palace to the humblest shack, every firstborn died, even of beasts. The death of Pharaoh's son shocked the palace servants. There lay the pale, lifeless form of the boy who supposedly was born of the gods. Finally, Pharaoh's stubborn will was broken. Calling for Moses and Aaron, he urged Israel to leave immediately. At God's command, the Israelites went to their Egyptian neighbors and borrowed, or more correctly, requested jewels of silver and gold and clothing. Gladly the Egyptians parted with their possessions, anything to remove these mysterious Israelites far out of their sight. Instead of leaving as fugitives, they marched out like conquerors, dressed in splendor. Search for Truth 2, Lesson 4, Chart 2. Israel leaves Egypt. After spending more than 400 years in Egypt, the Israelites were headed toward their promised land. Only the 600,000 men over 20 years of age are mentioned. Knowing that the people had rapidly multiplied, they may have numbered from 3 to 5 million. Another feature is noticed about this long marching procession. There was not one feeble person among their tribes. Psalms 105, verse 37. Notice that God selected Israel's route. A cloudy pillar ascended from earth to heaven to lead the host. The pillar of cloud shielded the blistering desert sun. When darkness fell, it became a brilliant column of fire, providing warmth from the chilling winds. Crossing the Red Sea. Once the initial shock of the midnight slaughter had subsided, Pharaoh again changed his mind. Why had he freed those laborers and highly skilled craftsmen? The order was given for 600 royal chariots to pursue and return them to Egypt. As the sun was setting, war chariots were seen coming from the north. Escape was impossible. The sea was on the east, mountains were on the south and west, and Israel was unarmed. Moses lifted his miracle-working rod over the sea. As he did, a strong east wind divided the waters into walls on either side and dried the seabed. The people moved forward in an orderly fashion until all were safe on the other side. As the cloud moved along, Pharaoh's army pressed forward. Again Moses' hand was uplifted, and the congealed wall of water on either side, Exodus 15:8, descended. As the sea returned to its bed, the waves engulfed the struggling Egyptians and horses. Apostle Paul compares this to water baptism, 1 Corinthians 10:1 and 2. All our fathers were under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. Spontaneously the redeemed nation sang praises unto the Lord. Bitter waters made sweet. Water was found, but it tasted bitter. God instructed Moses to cast a certain tree into the water, and it would become sweet. The healing of these bitter waters was a sign to Israel that God was also able and willing to heal their bodies. Exodus 15:26, I will put none of these diseases upon thee which I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am the Lord that healeth thee. Manna and quail given. After a month they marched towards Sinai. In this barren desert all provisions brought from Egypt were depleted. That evening the sky darkened, and an enormous flight of quail fell to the ground about their tents. The following morning they received bread. Until they reached Canaan 40 years later, for 6 days every week Israel received daily bread. The people called it manna, meaning it is a gift from heaven. Before reaching Mount Sinai, the people again clamored for water. This time Moses was told to strike a certain rock with his miracle-producing rod. Water gushed forth as if a hidden reservoir had suddenly been tapped. Law and Tabernacle. In the 3rd month, or about 6 weeks after leaving Egypt, they reached Sinai Peninsula. In this 2-mile wide, well-irrigated plain became Israel's camping ground and schoolhouse for the next year. Here, God gave his laws, ratified a covenant, and provided blueprints for the tabernacle, including a unique way to worship. 12 spies sent. About 16 months after leaving Egypt, the tribe stood at the threshold of Canaan. At Kadesh Barnea, 12 spies or scouts were appointed, a man from each tribe, to closely examine the territory. 40 days later, they returned with tales of highly advanced civilization, fertile land, beauty, and fruitfulness. 2 men brought a large cluster of grapes on a pole to provide the land's fertility. 10 of the men began to enumerate every discouragement they had seen. Vainly, Caleb and Joshua, the other 2 spies, tried to encourage the panic-stricken people. Unbelief's short-sightedness always sees the difficulties, while faith looks past them and sees God. By nightfall, the whole congregation was weeping like children. Just as they were ready to stone Moses, Aaron, Joshua, and Caleb, suddenly the glory of God appeared before the tabernacle. Their leader stood in the gap and prayed for his people. God forgave the people, but none above the age of 20 would enter the promised land. Wandering in the wilderness, the rest of their lives was punishment for unbelief. Brazen serpent. Shortly before the 40 years had expired, the people begged again for water. The new generation seemed as faithless as their fathers. Irritated and exhausted with their unbelief, Moses prostrated himself before the Lord. He was told to gather the congregation and speak to the same rock that had previously flowed. Instead, Moses struck the rock as he had done previously, and water gushed out. But he had disobeyed the command. Because of his unbelief and disobedience, he was prohibited from entering Canaan. Shortly after Aaron died, the people again tired of heavenly manna. This time there was no miraculous supply fulfilling their request. Instead, they were punished with fiery serpents. When people began dying from bites, they repented and urged Moses to pray for them. A brass replica of a serpent was to be mounted on a pole in the middle of the camp. By looking at the brass serpent, anyone who had been bitten would be healed. Healing power was not in the brass serpent itself, but in obeying God's plan. By looking to our crucified Savior on the cross, we can obtain both healing for our body and salvation for our soul. Search for Truth 2, Lesson 4, Chart 3. God makes a covenant with Israel. Fifth dispensation, law. Jews have traditionally observed the anniversary of the giving of the law with the Feast of Pentecost. On that same holy day, hundreds of years later, the gift of the Holy Spirit was given, marking the church's origin and fulfillment of Jeremiah's prophecy in chapter 31, verses 31 through 33. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it on their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. Sinai set the scene of the Mosaic covenant. On Moses' first trip, God disclosed his intention of renewing the Abrahamic covenant. They must obey the voice of the Lord and accept and keep his covenant. Then they will be to him a special treasure above all others. Furthermore, the Lord would make them a kingdom of priests, a holy nation, examples, instructors, and prophets to the heathen world. The outward sign of this consecration remained as the circumcision. Eagerly they agreed to obey the new commands without fully understanding the responsibility. Here are the three divisions of the law. Moral law relates to the rules of the right conduct. The moral law is basically found in the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20, verses 1 through 17. Civil law relates to the rights and duties of citizens of a community, Exodus chapters 21 through 23. And ceremonial law relates to religious ceremonies or rituals, principally in the book of Leviticus. The principles for Israel's civil society were superior to any other. In fact, the Mosaic ordinance have remained the grand model of all civil societies. To formally ratify the covenant, burnt sacrifices were offered on an altar. For 40 days, Moses communed with God, receiving the moral, civil, political, and social laws that would govern God's covenant people. 10 Commandments. These commandments were engraved on both sides of 2 tablets of stone, written with the finger of God, and kept for centuries in the Ark of the Covenant. 4 commandments relate to our attitude towards God. The other 6 deal with our attitudes towards people. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet. The law is like a thermometer. It indicates fever in the body, but it cannot administer a cure. Like a mirror, it clearly reveals the dirt and blemishes, but it cannot cleanse. Only the new covenant of grace could restore man's sinful condition. Jesus' blood provided the remedy for what the law diagnosed. Search for Truth 2, Lesson 4, Chart 4. A holy people separated unto God. Throughout the ages, God has diligently searched and longed for individuals who delighted to think and talk about him. Malachi chapter 3, verses 16-17. Such choice people have always been his pride and joy. He treasures them as he would the rarest of gems. God found Abraham. Here was a man who believed everything God told him. God designed that Israel would be a holy people, teaching every other nation how to please the Lord. Hence, they became a model for others to emulate. The word holy means separated and set apart, splendid, beautiful, pure, uncontaminated. He wanted Israel's lifestyle to be totally opposite from the ungodly nation under Satan's dominion. God's chosen one should worship, live, act, talk, eat, and dress differently from them. Each segment of the law was a protection and a benefit. Teach children to worship one God. The underlying faith of Israel is summed up in Deuteronomy 6, verses 4 and 5. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, and thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy might. Moses commanded that every Israelites indelibly etch these words in the minds of their children. Deuteronomy 6, verses 7 through 9. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children, and shalt talk of them when thou sittest in thine house, and when thou walkest by the way, and when thou liest down, and when thou risest up, and when thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thy hand, and they shall be as a frontlets between thy eyes, and thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and on thy gates. Tabernacle, place of worship. Another special mark of separation was Israel's place of worship. Because God desired to dwell among his people, he instructed that worship would be in a centralized tent structure. At this tabernacle, people would learn the means of approaching God and the manner in which he would manifest himself to them. An in-depth study reveals it to be the foreshadow of God's plan of redemption through Jesus Christ. Priests offer sacrifices and interpret law. Before Moses' day, the head of each family and the firstborn son exercised both spiritual and political forms of government. The Levites became the chosen ones to serve Israel's invisible king in the tabernacle. Among the priests, many sacred duties were teaching statutes of the Lord and acting as judges of the law. Their support came through a system called tithing, meaning 1/10. Each Israelite tithed their produce and cattle. 1/10 of the Levites' tithe was given to the priests for their support. Sacrificial offerings. When the tabernacle was introduced, the sacrificial offering became regulated. All sacrifices were to be offered on the brazen altar in the court of the tabernacle. Two types of sacrifices were offered, those without blood and those with blood. Bloodless sacrifices were first fruits and tithes, meat and drink offerings, and incense. Every Israelite presented tithes to the Levites and priests in gratitude to Yahweh. These consisted of grain, fruit, grapes, wool, meal, oil, or new wine. Blood sacrifices were of domestic animals or clean birds. 4 types of blood sacrifices were offered. Sin offerings atoned for ignorantly sinned against God and man. Trespass offerings were offered for some specific act of violating the law through error. Burnt offerings were self-dedication to God. And peace offerings, these offerings signified communing with God and included fellowship and friendship. The entire system of sacrifices and offerings symbolized the day when men would present themselves as a living sacrifice unto God. See Romans 12:1. And would offer the sacrifice of praise to God with his lips. Hebrews 13:15. The Sabbath, a Jewish day of rest and joy. The seventh day of the week was established as a day of rest and delight to bless and refresh man. Neither man nor beast could perform any work on this day. Special feast days. Every male Jew was required to attend 3 festivals each year: the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Feast of Weeks, Pentecost, and the Feast of Tabernacles, or Booths. Each symbolized some unique historical event. 2 other feast days were the Feast of Trumpets, announcing the beginning of the civil Jewish New Year, and the Day of Atonement. A blood sacrifice was offered by the high priest for the sins of the people. Besides these 5 feast days, every 7th year was declared a sabbatical year. The fields were not planted. Every 50th year was the year of Jubilee, during which all property reverted to the original owner. Moral laws. These laws describe right conduct for God's people, proper treatment of other people, honest principles of life, how to be sexually virtuous, restrictions for choosing marriage partners, sexual rights in marriage, responsibilities and treatment of husbands and wives, divorce and remarriage, and God's judgment of homosexuality, sexual perversion, idolatry, and witchcraft. 9 of the 10 commandments are moral laws. In the book of Deuteronomy are such abominations: graven images, chapter 7, verse 25. Human sacrifices, chapter 12, verse 31. A defective animal sacrifice, chapter 17, verse 1. Witchcraft and spiritualism, chapter 18, verses 10 through 12. Religious prostitution, chapter 23, verse 18. Remarrying a defiled woman, chapter 24, verse 4. Interchange of apparel between sexes, Deuteronomy 22 and 5. Other abominations towards God are pride, lying, murder, sowing discord, and a froward heart, Proverbs 6, verses 16 through 19, Proverbs 11 and 20, and Proverbs 12:22. Dietary laws. They were to observe which meats should be avoided. Any animal that divides the hoof and chews the cud may be eaten, such as a cow, sheep, oxen, and deer. But those that chew the cud with undivided hoof, such as a camel, horse, or rabbit, shall not be eaten. Because the pig divides the hoof, but does not chew the cud, its flesh is also unclean. All seafood with fins and scales may be eaten, but shellfish, shrimp, lobster, crab, and oysters are unclean. God's dietary law also specified that neither fat nor blood were to be eaten. Leviticus 3:17. The blood also assimilates whatever is in the stomach, whether nutritious or poisonous, and distributes it to the various parts of the body. Therefore, diseased germs are first carried in the bloodstream before affecting the flesh of an animal. What was the purpose of the Jewish dietary laws? Deuteronomy 5:33 says that ye may live and that may be well with you, and ye may prolong your days. Customs and ceremonies. Incorporated into the personal lives and habits of the people were religious overtones. Hygienic rules and regulations were given for purification of women, washing of hands, detecting and treatment of diseases, and uncleanness in general. Search for Truth 2, Lesson 4, Chart 5. God dwells with his covenant people. Knowing Israel would soon face the idolatry of Canaanite religion, God prepared them with laws covering every phase of life: moral, civil, political, and social. God's law contains safeguards against the corrupting influence of heathenistic attitudes. Arrangement of tents. The camp was carefully organized for marching, with the tabernacle in the very center. This portrayed that all things must be done systematically and carefully, and that God wished to occupy the center of their lives. Every tent door faced the tabernacle. The Levites were situated between the people and the tabernacle. Between people and the church is the man of God. Preachers are God's representative. Malachi 2 verse 7 says, "For the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek the law at his mouth, for he is the messenger of the Lord of hosts." The tabernacle always faced the east. On each of the four sides camped and marched 3 tribes. Between the tabernacle and the other tribes, in a protective way, were 4 groups of Levites: Moses, Aaron and his sons, and the Kohathites, Gershonites, and Merarites. The cloud's movement specified marching or resting. More than 3 million people were dependent upon God for daily subsistence and guidance. He is still well pleased when his people depend on his Spirit for leadership and guidance. Search for Truth 2, Lesson 4, Chart 6. A new way of worship. Now let's examine each piece of furniture in God's dwelling place known as the tabernacle. Daily, weekly, monthly, and annual sacrifices were offered. Continually, the smoke ascended to heaven. All Israel, young and old, rich and poor, priests and laymen came into the court. But only the priest could enter into the holy place. The high priest alone could enter into the Holy of Holies, and then only once a year. The brazen altar. Entering the court of the tabernacle, the first item was the altar of burnt offering. The positioning of the altar denotes the absolute necessity for blood atonement before fellowshipping with an infinite holy God. Man's first need is to have his sins and impurities purged by the blood. Brazen laver. Located between the brazen altar and the door to the tabernacle was the brazen laver. The laver was strictly for ceremonial washing of the priest prior to entering the holy place. Tabernacle coverings and frame. 10 curtains of fine linen dyed blue, purple, and scarlet with figurines of cherubims woven into the material constituted the ceiling or inner covering of the tabernacle. The tabernacle frame consisted of 40 gold-covered boards, 10 cubits long, and set in 40 sockets or holders of silver. Separating the holy place from the Holy of Holies hung a veil of the same material and workmanship as the 10 inner curtains. Only the high priest bearing sacrificial blood could enter this section. Table of showbread. Upon entering the holy place, to the right was a table. Loaves of bread sprinkled with frankincense, dishes, spoons, and incense cups and bowls for drink offerings were placed on the table. Showbread, or the bread of presence, was set before the face, or presence of God, dwelling behind the veil in the Holy of Holies. As the bread supplied nourishment for the priest, so Christ meets the needs of his children today. Altar of incense. Situated in the center of the holy place, it provided an offering of incense to God. Twice a day, a priest offered incense made from an exact prescription with the morning and evening sacrifices. Incense symbolizes prayer and communion with God. The continual burning shows the necessity for continuous and persistent prayer. 1 Thessalonians 5 verses 17 and 18. The golden candlestick. The golden candlestick was the most ornate object in the holy place. It provided light for the priests to daily perform their duties. The candlestick typifies Jesus Christ, the true light of the world. John chapter 1 verses 6 through 9 and John chapter 8 verse 12. However, those who believe in him are also the light of the world. See Matthew 5 and 12. Illuminating the dark places of the world, the Holy Spirit shines forth from the lives that he has filled. The Ark of the Covenant. Here in the holiest of holies was the most essential part of the tabernacle. Inside this gold-covered wooden box was kept the law written on 2 tablets of stone by the finger of God, a pot of manna, and Aaron's rod which budded and blossomed. The ark's lid, known as the mercy seat, was made of solid gold. On either end was a cherubim with wings extended, facing the other, looking downward to the mercy seat. Made of gold, the most precious metal, the mercy seat represented God's most precious attribute, mercy. It covered the law as he covers the sins and offenses of his people. This was where the high priest sprinkled blood, typifying the sacrifice of Christ. The Ark of the Covenant with its mercy seat was the most important object in the whole tabernacle and the focal point of attention, especially on the annual Day of Atonement. Search for Truth 2, Lesson 4, Chart 7. Good things to come. When Paul recalled the beautiful illustration of redemption found in the tabernacle, he said in Hebrews 9, verses 11 and 12, "But Christ being come and high priest of good things to come by a greater and more perfect tabernacle, neither by the blood of goats and calves, but by his own blood, he entered in once into the holy place, having obtained eternal redemption for us." As a whole, the tabernacle typifies the man, Jesus Christ. Our first glimpse of the good news about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection is seen in Moses' writings. God was teaching Israel that his anger against sin is severe. His broken law will be satisfied only with the giving of life for life. An example of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. An Israelite sin offering, shown in the lower part of the chart, was a foreshadowing of Christ's sacrificial offering for our redemption. Notice the similarities. The blood of an innocent lamb was sprinkled on the brazen altar and throughout the tabernacle as a sin covering. The priest washed himself before entering the tabernacle. The priest enjoyed the beauty of the holy place. He ate the bread and smelled the incense. Once a year, the high priest went behind the veil into the most holy presence of God. Because of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, which is the gospel, or good news, every believer becomes a priest and is eligible to enter the holy presence of God. The veil that once separated man from a holy God has been ripped apart. The brazen altar reminds us of the cross and Jesus' blood that cleanses and remits our sin. The brazen laver reminds us of water baptism and Jesus' burial. When we bury the old man, we are buried with Jesus Christ into his death, and his blood remits or washes away our sins. His word becomes our sustaining bread of life at the table of showbread. The altar of incense represents our daily commune with him in prayer and praise. His light, like the golden candlestick, begins to shine through us, attracting others to Jesus Christ. But best of all, the way has been opened into the holiest of holies, the very presence of God himself. We can freely enter into his presence any hour of the day. The tabernacle was God's way of announcing, good things are coming.